These are some thoughts I have on the Malazan magic system, which is predominantly warrens and holds. I'll preface this by saying that I understand the discussion going on around whether something is a soft magic system or a hard magic system. And I would like to present a question concerning this. What makes a magic system hard or soft? Is it the workings behind scenes that enforce some sort of inner consistency in that system? Or is it whether this set of rules are presented to the reader or not? In other words, we know that Malazan was gained through tabletop RPGs. If we consider the possibility that the authors of Malazan have a very rigid set of rules that are not presented to us, is that a soft or hard magic system? Is it the fact that the reader is presented those rules and are expected to deduce things from those rules that makes a system rigid or soft, hard or soft? It's hard to tell. It's actually, I imagine one could argue one way or another concerning this debate. But we know from interviews and comments that in the case of the Malazan universe, the magic system serves the narrative. Some people will argue, well, yeah, but that leads to deus ex machina through magic. And others will reply, yeah, but a good story, a good ending, is worth more than whether you use a deus ex machina or not. Anyway, I understand that the magic in Malazan is supposed to evoke wonder and the unknown, and that this exercise I'm going to do right now is the quintessential list maker effort, but also try to paint what I think the Malazan magic system is. All this being said, this discussion will contain a lot of spoilers, particularly from Full of Light. So far, the last book from the Carcanas trilogy that has been released. Now, hopefully, Walking Shadow is in the making. It's being written right now. But yeah, it's the last book that has been published from Carcanas, because there's a lot of information, biased as it might be, is useful. So the way I like to think about the Malazan magic system is through four main concepts. Some of these concepts might be the same, but I don't think there's enough evidence to assert that they are the same. So I'll just leave them as separate concepts, and in the future one might discover if they are actually the same or not. What are those four concepts? You have realms, warrens, holds, and high houses. First element is realm. The term realm is used many times, apparently with a different connotation than the term warren. And a realm seems to be a physical notion. In sci-fi terms, one will call them parallel dimensions or parallel universes. They are different from the Malazan main universe, what usually the fandom calls Wu, which is the main warren where the Malazan Empire is located. They are different in the fact that they have different geographies. the passage of time is different. And one can even imagine, say, a set of curved planes, and the higher the curvature, the time is affected. We know this is the case in our universe by means of, say, general relativity. We have a curvature of space-time and it affects the passage of time. We could imagine something like that. And then you have all these curves superposed one over the other with varying degrees of curvature. And that makes not only the distance between points in one universe with respect to the other different, but also the passage of time. So that's a very sci-fi way of thinking about realms. In principle, not every realm seems to be a warren. Examples: Night Eternal in Fall of Light, and also in Forge of Darkness I think we see it. It doesn't seem to be a warren in the traditional sense. But also we have the Imperial Warren. Why is it not a warren? Well, we can discuss that later. It doesn't seem to share some of the properties that what we usually call warren have. And we can even say Dragnipur. Well, is it a warren? Maybe yes, but it seems to be a realm, a micro realm, because there are some properties that we can identify from warrens that are not present in this inside world that is in Dragnipur. So this is realms, a physical notion. The next one is warrens. Warrens are essentially a metaphysical notion. It's an abstract space that is a repository or a cluster of power. This power is magical in nature. And this magic is aspected. When one think of aspect, one think of some sort of theme of idea that permeates this power. Fire, dark, light. The mind, the conscious mind, nature, war. You will notice that there are more basic building blocks for some of these warrens, and then there's some emerging or more sophisticated elements that eventually come up. For instance, if there are no conscious minds in a universe, there's still shadow and light, but there's probably not a warren of the mind that, like we know, exists in the Malazan universe, which is Mokra. Warrens were supposedly created by Krull, the maker of paths. He has the ability, the capability of creating these warrens that seem to be realms too, to some extent. But not every warren seems to be a realm. Case in point, Mokra. We see in Midnight Tides how Seren Pedak has some interaction with Mokra. And there doesn't seem to be a physical realm associated with Mokra. Of course, this makes sense because Mokra is the warren of the mind, so it will be fitting that it doesn't have a physical manifestation, but just some sort of psychological one. And so we have to go now that we're talking about the warrens, elder warrens or holds. Of course, the terminology is not homogeneous. There are places that are sometimes called elder warrens, sometimes holds. Some things that are holds are never called elder warrens. Some things that are elder warrens are never called holds, and some are called both. There seems to be some technical difference between the two, although this might be subjective. There seem to be technical differences between how one accesses one and the other. This is fitting since the elder warrens are usually associated with elder gods. And we know from Fall of Light that Krull created warrens so that magic was free, egalitarian. equally accessible to mortals without the mediation of gods. This will probably become important when we talk about how one might interpret what warrens are. Now, all this being said, is every warren a hold? It's not clear that's the case, because if warrens are things created by Kroll, I could mention, for example, Night Eternal, and also many of the realms that some characters go through during the Book of the Fallen, not in Fall of Light, but in the Book of the Fallen, and also the visions that Heboric has in House of Chains. It seems that realms are a physical manifestation that probably precedes the creation of Kroll. So then warrens are a deliberate creation of Kroll with the aim of democratizing, so to speak, magic. And then realms are a physical phenomenon that is behind all this, that presumably precedes Kroll. I say this because it's hard to believe that Night Eternal, that is supposedly the realm from which Dracanus gets the title, Suzerain of Night, was created by Kroll, when one gets the impression that Kroll and Dracanus are from the same generation. Even if we admit that Asathanae begin to exist exactly when the Malazan universe came to exist, still, if Night Eternal came to existence with the rest of the Malazan universe, Kroll will have to be capable of creating it before the Malazan universe existed. And it feels weird that if Dracanus and Kroll are from the same generation, that Kroll created Night Eternal and then it was filled with this dark aspect, and then Dracanus came in and did what he did to gain the title Suzerain of Night. This poses this dichotomy between a natural occurring phenomenon of different worlds being generated, and then Kroll having the capability of creating something that is similar but is not the same. It's similar in the sense that, it creates an additional world or dimension, but it's not naturally occurring. So for now, I'm not convinced that every realm is a warren. Warren seems to be particularly linked to what Kroll does and with the metaphysical aspect of this magical element being filling in these warrens. This also gives some meaning to the name warren. If a warren is some sort of, let's think in terms of, a hole in the fabric of the existence, and then that hole is filled with this magical energy that is aspected, and then these holes you put a guardian on them, and that guardian happens to be a dragon, then you have essentially what seems to be the gamble, the deal that Kroll did with the dragons to safeguard his warrens. That said, most warrens and holes seem to be associated with realms. As I mentioned, it seems clear that Kroll is capable. When he creates a warren, he also creates a hole. Sorry, not a hole. A realm. When Kroll creates these warrens, he seems to be creating, for the most part, a realm too. But now we go to the most complicated part. High houses and gods. how do they fit in all this framework? It's harder to integrate. There are warrens that don't seem to have a high house. The Imperial Warren, Rus, and Zerg, to name a few, don't have a high house associated. Again, maybe they do, but we don't get to find out in the books. Why? Maybe they are irrelevant, so it's hard to tell. But as far as we can tell, they don't have high house. On the other hand, high houses don't seem to be exclusively linked to one warren. The House of Chains seems to have no associated warren. High House War that we see in the very end of the Book of the Fallen Immersion seems to have agents that are associated with different realms, warrens, holds, whatever. You have Togan Fanderay with the Beast Hold. You have Fenner that sits on a warren that is only referred by his own name, Fenner's Warren. And presumably Trake took that warren. And then we have the Guardians that are presumably the Ascended Bridgeburner, who happen to be also associated with High House Death. So here we have houses, high houses, that have members across different warrens, apparently, as far as I can tell. We will continue this line now when we talk about the interpretations, but I would like to touch on the Deck of Dragons. Deck of Dragons, it's a human method to make sense of things that are going on, of agents of different high houses, or unaligned, because the unaligned are still ascendants or gods, but are not in a high house. So it's basically like a method to make sense of the world. Because the Deck of Dragons is a model, it is bound to be limited in what it can say about reality. Of course, this fictional reality. So there's never a full picture of what's going on in the deck. On the other hand, we know from some commentaries by Erickson that there seems to be a fractal. No, he doesn't say fractal, he says quantum element to the Deck of Dragons, insofar as the reading of the Deck of Dragons not only predicts the outcomes, the future, it causes the future to happen. So the moment you throw the deck, reality and the reading of the deck become entangled in terms of more real scientific terms. When you throw the deck, the wave function collapses. And what happens in the reading in some way causes reality to collapse into one option among many possibilities. Of course, if by now you're still not aware, that's why I would argue the Deck of Dragons is called the Deck of Dragons. It's trying to model high houses that are power structures, presumably on top of warrens, and these warrens are being safeguarded by dragons, at least sometime after the end of Fall of Light. So this is one of the ways in which the Deck of Dragons is, that's why it's of dragons, because the dragons were the ones that guarded these warrens for a long time. Or maybe the thrones of those warrens, if they had any. So now the last point I'd like to make is the interpretation of warrens. The way I like to think about warrens is as a metaphor to power. This is tricky because A metaphor of what kind of power? In the Malazan universe, we have military power, political power, that there's already power. So if those elements are already active in the Malazan universe, what might the magic system refer to? It's actually hard to tell. But one can still propose an idea that warrants are a metaphor to a very broad form of power, not within the Malazan universe, but as a commentary in our universe. And if warrants are the sources of power, then houses and thrones are power structures imposed over those sources of power. And this is very fitting. One can draw many commentaries from this. The first one, take Shadow Throne. Killenvet becomes Shadow Throne somewhere between Night of Knives and the first part of Gardens of the Moon. He's a relatively young god. But we know there has been high mages, high priests, followers of Shadow, way before Killenvet even dreamed of becoming Shadow Throne. This suggests a very provocative idea. The system often is more important than the individual. The god that claims the throne, those can come and go. But the system is trickier, is more resilient. It remains in time. And some might argue that that's the case for how political or economic in a more broad sense, is applied in our world. One president, one prime minister probably isn't capable of changing things in a measurable way. Even with intentions, the system will work in such a way as to keep things in their equilibrium. Of course, there are other elements to this metaphor of power, which is one of the elements of Malazan that have been discussed at the highest level. There are academic papers talking about this. And it's, of course, the element of the accessibility, equality. If warrants are the mediation of power, we know in the Malazan universe, it's not that anyone can access warrants, but a warrant wielder can come from anywhere. Doesn't matter gender, race, status. You're born a talent, and you use magic from that warrant. This is an equalizer. That's how one can think on that. And we go back to Kroll. Initially, I have to make a parenthesis here. If you read Carcanas, if you read Full of Light, you know that holds don't actually precede warrants. Erastus the Errant he basically tried to wrest control from this magic system from Kroll. But the moment the Errant is trying to do that, Kroll mentions that the warrants already exist. You already created the warrants, way before Erastus tried even to control them. So this is an interesting subversion. You spend the entire Book of the Fallen thinking that first came holds and then warrants, and then warrants came first, and then this guy tried to appropriate them. And I know that Carcanas is unreliably narrated, but what I will say is that the Book of the Fallen is too. So enough about that. So, back to Kroll. Initially, it seems that to get access to magic, you had to bargain with a god, somewhere in the far past of the Malazan universe, or some realm of it. Then Kroll seems to have democratized magic by introducing warrants. With warrants, people don't need to bargain with gods to get access to these magic systems, to these magic powers. So as much as we can think of Kroll as relatively cruel or cold at times, things like that, because yeah, he's an elder god. He partook of blood sacrifice, he benefited from it. Obviously, blood sacrifice from mortals, people with a lot less power than himself. We still can see parallels in how, in a way, some forms of political systems might work in reality. Of course, I'm ignoring a lot of nuance in how there's still power in democratic systems and how that power might skew the results of a democracy in one way or another, particularly in terms of the access to information that some people have and others don't. Omitting all that, Kroll seems to have introduced a democratization system with the warrants. That's primarily the main interpretation parallel that I can draw. Mortals don't need to bargain with gods anymore. They can access directly to these sources of power, which in hindsight fits very well with the distinction between two interesting titles that we read in the series: High Mage and High Priest. It's not the same. Both have access to power, but a High Mage doesn't have to bargain with any god, while a High Priest seems to be in close contact with a god. In any case, blood sacrifice to some extent was left behind, to a large extent. So the only point we are not covering here will be then the secondary, so to speak, magic systems, namely alchemy, and some of the magic used by, for instance, the Wiccans. It will seem that those forms of magic, at least the one used by the Wiccans and some others, are essentially wielding the magical power residing on the warren or realm that there's already in. If we assume that the Malazan universe is actually the warren of Burn. And so shamanistic magic like the one that the Wiccans use is just channeling the energy already in the same place you are, instead of picking it up from some other dimension or realm. And it seems reasonable that that's the case. Well, this is basically my overview of the Malazan magic system and how it works, how one might interpret it. If you have any thoughts on this, if you agree or disagree, well, let me know. It's always a topic I like to think, and I always mention that I do understand that these things are probably meant to have people doing exactly what I'm doing now, which is making theories and letting my imagination go wild with ideas about this. Of course, the risk with this kind of metaphor and with any kind of metaphor and symbolism is that since things are not explicit, there's always the possibility that someone might interpret them in a way that was not intended. But as I often argue, that's still worth it. If I find an interesting interpretation of something that is in there that wasn't intended but is meaningful to me, I think it's worth it. That being said, I'll leave it at that, and I hope to talk to you all soon.